The Merlaga Sessions is our long-standing 7-part seminar series, as everybody knows, which focuses on scholarly research and critical approaches to architecture, history, and theory. This semester, the series is entitled In and Out of Scale, and it examines select ideas and projects that consider the scalar relationship of the built environment, from radio transmission and television broadcasting to the model and the chair. Organized from the large to small scale, topics will include the remote transmission of information in the Cold War, which we're pleased to have Alfredo speak about today. Then in 2 weeks' time, we will move to the televangelical spaces that were either retrofitted to accommodate television or designed exclusively for television technology between the late 1950s and early 80s. These spaces include worship sites, churches, hospitals, university campuses. Then we will move to interpretations and misinterpretations of artificial land in post-war Japan, how the construction of new garden cities not only scaled up building commissions but also created new local economies. Then we will move to the staging of miniature landscapes for large-scale photographs, how models were used as descriptive instruments in 19th century London, and a consideration of how the Indian planter's chair affirms past influences while also sensitively conversing with the present. It's a pleasure to have Alfredo Thiermann here, who is an architect and assistant professor for history and theory of architecture at EPL. His scholarship is at the intersection of architecture and different media. He will be speaking on his new book, which I have not seen in physical form. So it exists. It just literally came out last week, I think. Literally, if memory serves me right, it was the 24th is what was officially on the MIT Press website. Full disclosure, only know some articles that are based on the kind of research, so very curious to see, to hear more about how things have evolved. So, and to kick off. So, just to be clear, today is radio, in 2 weeks it's television.
Wonderful.
So, radio, does everybody know what radio is? It's like the precursor to the podcast, just in case nobody has ever heard of radio before. And I will shoot this one.
I guess I'll do this. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. It is interesting to speak about radio these days because, on the one hand, for I think some parts of our generation, it became really a kind of like archaeological media. But on the other hand, I think in certain parts of the world, radio remains the most used source for the access of information for different reasons. And also, I think because of our visually stimulated cultures, apparently radio is having a comeback in form, as it's been just said, in terms of podcasts and so on. So radio apparently is both something extremely outdated, and for some people it became a kind of new form of avant-garde, paradoxically. I decided to just use the book as a way to as a means to explain you how I've been looking at the radio and architecture. The book arrived. The only copy I have arrived on my mailbox last week, and I thought it would be interesting to use the book itself. The materiality of the book to speak about the materiality of radio. Very briefly, I really started this project as an accidental encounter with a broadcasting house in the east of Berlin. The first time I visited the city, I'm originally from Chile, and when I encountered this building, I I really had no idea how to read such an object with my limited knowledge of the discipline of architecture. It was way too big to relate it to any kind of cultural building. It also for where it was located, it just looked like a massive industry of some kind. And then I entered this building that at the time was still a ruin in the outskirts of Berlin. And yet inside you encounter this extremely refined interiors, but that you can count them on the hundreds, right? So this odd encounter really forced me to start looking at, okay, what kind of buildings are this? What is the context that produced them? And it was in that moment when a little bit of a Pandora box exploded. I started to pull the thread, and it took me to very different locations and also very further back in time to understand what was the material origin of this apparently immaterial medium that is radio. So that's me being very honest that I didn't start this project with an extremely speculative formulation or theoretical stand, but it was with the encounter of an object in which my knowledge of architecture was simply not sufficient to make sense of it, and then I realized that basically no one has, I couldn't, reach out for help to anybody, so I had to do the job myself. But okay, this is how it started, but then very quickly I realized the resonances literally between radio and our contemporary condition. I think also something that I think is important to say at the beginning is that I think there is very little historical about radio. I think we live in the age of radio. If you think about it, you are constantly sending and emitting radio signals. You don't even realize you walk around the world, and because of the devices that are around you, you are a portable broadcasting house, whether you like it or not. So when we start to think about what are the implications in space and in politics of this condition in which space is being broadcasted through the electromagnetic medium, I realized that, again, it was very little historical about radio, and at the end, what one is interrogating is really our contemporary condition. And perhaps as another preliminary remark, for me, it was a very interesting way to look and be enchanted again with buildings in an era in which we are constantly being told that things are immaterial, that we live in the age of the cloud, and that all the politics around the management of our information is something that is very difficult to grasp because it's become invisible and immaterial. And when one starts to look at this contemporary condition that is radio, nothing could be further from the truth. The more wired, the more networked the world becomes, the bigger and bigger the objects and the buildings that we need for to fulfill that apparently immaterial promise. So this is another kind of like important lesson that I started to see when I started to look at this project. So now let's just go straight to the thing. So this is the introductory pages of the book, and I got fascinated. I don't know how many of you have seen Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire. You see here some of the opening scenes in which an angel seems to fly over the city of Berlin, crossing without much friction walls, doors, windows, and even the Berlin Wall. And there's these beautiful scenes, and when here we see Bruno Ganz, who recently died, flies even inside Hans Scharoun Staatsbibliothek. Is one of the most fascinating scenes I've seen about Berlin. And these angels, again, ignore everything material about the city, but yet there is a very interesting scene at the beginning, and this is the scene you see here, when the angel starts to approach this radio tower that I will tell you more in a second, and then the angel starts to hear contested voices. Some of them are in English, some of them are in German, and you start to realize that the moment when Wenders shot the film in the 80s, the ethereal space of Berlin was even more divided up in the air because of the overlap of radio frequencies trying to let's say, act upon each other even more than the divided city on the ground. And in a way, I was fascinated by the fact that the angel could perceive the agency of a set of buildings that were not on the screen, of course, but nevertheless were having an incredibly important impact in the structure of the city by virtue of the dissemination of radio waves. So this is a little bit the fascination of the project, how Berlin during the Cold War, a divided city, because of the agency of the wall, nevertheless was experiencing different forms of unity and division in its electromagnetic space. And I started to discover that in order for that overlap to happen, a lot of buildings had to be built, and the city was really reshaped under the conditions of radio. So here you see a few images at the introduction of the book. I'm just going to read, in between my presentation, I'm going to read a few excerpts of the book. So here I go with the first one. So on August 13, 1961, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, began construction of the Berlin Wall. Built within East German territory, but encircling western sectors, it turned West Berlin into an island situated within the eastern zone. Both symbolically immaterial, the wall cut through everything that had previously connected the city and made it a singular entity. It broke the continuity of roads and streets, telephone cables, train tracks, and subway lines, and even cut straight through buildings. At the same time, it separated families and friends and severed social ties as much as economic and commercial exchange. As an architectural element, the wall was faultlessly averse to all things material. Only the invisible transmission of music, sounds, and information disseminated via electromagnetic waves laid outside its control. In other words, the Berlin Wall broke the continuity of everything except the agency of a system with no apparent design and no cohesion in and of itself. Built up over a span of nearly 100 years, this system operated through numerous technological objects and cultural practices, all housed in a series of institutions and facilities dispersed throughout the city. Taken together, they constituted a materially grounded infrastructure with an invisible but not immaterial agency that effectively challenged the divisive power of the notorious wall. So here you see this contrast between a city divided by a wall, yet united and redivided again by the agency of this apparently invisible medium, yet with an enormous material agency. The structure of the book is through scales. So each chapter deals with the scale, so I think it's very pertinent, and I'm very happy to be part of this series that deals with the question of scale, because I tend to name the architecture of radio as a transscalar phenomenon. So let's just start with the chapters. Chapter 1 deals with the scale of the territory. And each chapter has also a central object that I wanted to understand, to unpack, and in order to, let's say, discover or understand the existence of that object, I had to, of course, accumulate a number of other objects around it. So the central object of this chapter is this map that you see here. It is a map of West Berlin drawn by the Stasi, the secret police, in which the Stasi is showing how they were doing urban planning, but to block electromagnetic waves with jamming stations. So here we're starting to see how space is electrified. The agency of the wall, of the Berlin Wall, is not only in the ground, it's trying to be deployed, and the airwaves as well. And we're starting to see a conflict of overlapping signals depicted in this map. So again, when I encountered this map, I tried to make sense of it, and again, I had to go back and back in time in order to do that. So let's just start from the beginning. One of the most fascinating objects that I found, and one can say that it's really a certain kind of beginning of the infrastructure or the intersection of architecture with radio, could be found in this building. Here you're seeing the interior, And here you're seeing a slightly more monumental depiction of its exterior. It's called the Große Funkstelle, the big radio station designed by Hermann Muthesius. I don't know if you know who Hermann Muthesius was. He's a very important architect in the 1920s in Germany. He was head of the Werkbund, this association of industrialist designers and architects that was extremely influential in Germany, Weimar Republic. Hermann Muthesius designed this building that, as you see here in the interior, was only crafted to host machines. These machines that you see here, they're basically alternators that amplify current in order to reach extremely further distances. What is very interesting about this building is that the few times that it has been mentioned in the history of modern architecture, it is referred as a kind of moment of invention of radio. But what is interesting in reality is that the moment when this building was inaugurated in 1920, it was perfectly obsolete. Its potential agency was already evaporated. Why? Because this was the last attempt in which Germany, through its colonial project, tried to have a hold of the entire globe through radiotelegraphy. The year in which this building was completed, 1920, was also the year of the end of First World War, and when Germany has lost its colonies and therefore no reason to expand its radiophonic apparatus. But let's look a little bit at the history of how this came to be. So Nauen didn't start like this with this gigantic infrastructure. It started more like this. It was a little hut with a big tower, and at the time passed, the tower was growing bigger and the hut was being depicted smaller and smaller. As I told you, this building was the conclusion of a much larger trajectory, which was the trajectory in which a company called Telefunken, which one can say is one of the very first global tech empires, tried to conquer the world through radiotelegraphy. So here you're seeing the stations that Telefunken built all over the world. So these are the stations in Iquitos, in the jungle in Peru. Here you see this an amazing image of Lima in the 1910s with a radio antenna in the top of the San Cristobal Hill connecting the jungle in Iquitos with the central centers of operation in Lima, and then from Lima back to Germany. Why? Because of course there was German extraction of rubber, of caucho in the Amazonas. And therefore, you know, the big aspiration of Telefunken as a global tech empire was to connect the places of extraction and the periphery with the centers of administration and computation in either North America or Europe. So all these buildings that are many, were built way before, as I said, the construction of Nauen, who was the last attempt to have a centralized station of transmission. These images are extremely fascinating, are the stations built by Telefunken in Camina, in Togo. And this became really the most important radio station built in the entire global south, and was the center of operations of the German colonial project in Africa through radio. Here you see this interesting drawing in which you see that, you know, again, it's a very little house, but with a large set of 6 gigantic antennas, and it says here Richtung Nauen, so the antennas are oriented towards Germany. This is an interesting station also in Dar es Salaam and what is today Tanzania. And I want to make a little bit of a more close reading of these 2 images that we have here. These 2 interiors are extremely fascinating and at the same time terrifying to me. These are these modernist interiors that you might think are, these were built in 1914, so you might think that this could only be done in either a very developed place in Germany or maybe here in the Netherlands. These interiors with big glass panels are an all steel structure, are built in Camina. These are the interiors where energy had to be fabricated in order to broadcast. Radio at this point was very important. Also, we're speaking here about radio telegraphy, not radio broadcasting, so it's a point-to-point communication. But still, the technical medium of architecture of radio at this point is a problem of form and energy. It's of form, we're speaking about the sizes of the antennas. Energy is how much capacity of electricity you can amplify in order to reach distances. And here we are seeing the interiors where energy was produced in these stations. And now I just want to read a few words for you. Yes, okay. So, colonial settlements were the mainstay of Telefunken's worldwide expansion during the 1910s, with the company keen to promote the strategic advantages provided by its technology. Proposing the construction of Telefunken stations in U.S. colonial settlements designed and partially implemented by Chicago architect Daniel Burnham in the Philippines, Telefunken Zeitung, which was the journal through which Telefunken was disseminating their inventions, used the case of Manila, the capital of Philippines, as you all know, as an example of, quote, how transportable field stations can gain great importance in future uprising in the colonies as a substitute for the landlines that natives easily destroy. So basically, Telefunken identified that natives destroy the landlines, and therefore radio telegraphy is an extremely useful tool for the colonial project. Indeed, the destruction of the telegraph lines connecting Germany with its colonies in Togo and Cameroon, so the landlines connecting Germany with its colonies in Africa were cut in 1911, and thus has been one of the central motivations for improving Nauen station transmission capacities in 1911. So when we see here that Nauen passes from this size to this size, coincide with this event in which the lines were cut, and therefore it has to expand its capacities. You see here in the globe, right? 1910, this circle, 1911, this circle, we are within Togo, right? So the higher the tower, the larger the circle was expanding globally. Okay, so supplied with a new tower and more powerful engine, the facility would soon be able to reach without relay stations a radius of 5,000 kilometers, the distance between Berlin and Camina and Togo. In 1913, construction began on the new receiving and transmitting station for radio telegraphy in Camina, the most powerful one in the entire global south. And that's the station I was showing you here, right? Huge quantities of material had to be mobilized to connect Togo with Nauen through the apparent immateriality of radio. All the steel elements for the transmission tower were brought from Germany, and Telefunken had to build roads, cross swamps, import cranes, construct a reservoir, and finally lay 5 kilometers of rail tracks between the port of Lomé and Camina to transport the heavy material to site. In 1914, the station in Camina was equipped with 400-meter and 375-meter towers and a 100-kilowatt steam electric turbine, enabling it to relay messages receiving from Nauen and then to East Africa, Tabora, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and most importantly, to the station in Monrovia in Liberia, which linked Africa with South America via the transoceanic cable. So you see now the extent of the global network. So the reach of radio transmissions is directly linked to the height of the antenna, when I was telling you, and the capacity of the machines to amplify current. It is a problem of form and power. In previous images, we saw the size of the antennas towering over the stations in Nauen and Camina. There is an intrinsic modernism associated with the form of those towers, with their sheer size, the presence of steel, and the lightness of these structures. But there is another thread of modernity connecting these stations, one related to the interiors and the question of power, understand here in German as the exception of power as Kraft, as force. And it's illustrated here by two images that depict the spaces for energy production in the Camina station, and a third image showing one of the most canonical interiors in Berlin, built only a few years before. So here I'm speaking about power as Kraft, as energy, right? And you see these two interiors, but this interior you all know, which is the interior of the turbine factory of Peter Barents. Is the, if you need to know two modernist buildings, this is one of them, but very few people have realized that what they was actually fabricated here were turbines. Why? We'll see in a second. So In 1903, Telefunken's parent company, so Telefunken was owned by AEG, and had embarked on an ambitious program to manufacture steam turbines for autonomous electricity production. So in 1909, work was completed on the new factory that was part of this program, the turbine hall designed by Peter Behrens. A mere 2 years after the building's completion, the electricity generated by AEG manufactured steam turbines far outstripped the combined total of electrical energy generated by all other power plants of Germany. So basically, all the turbines that were being produced here were producing more energy than all the power plants connected to the grid. It's a kind of amazing data. So, from a functional point of view, arguably the most important effect of the AEG turbine hall was that it allowed vast swaths of Germany's industrial sector to be autonomous from a still underdeveloped electrical grid that depended mostly on access to coal. So, like factories in other industrial sectors, the station in Camina benefited from the remote access to electricity afforded by the steam turbines developed by AEG. Yet what was unique to radiotelegraphy, that it linked the centers of political and economical power, and here I'm speaking power in the terms of Macht, with the periphery where resources were extracted through the power of electricity, Kraft. So you see this double exception of the word power in Germany. Macht, the political power, and Kraft, the electrical power, are linked through the infrastructure of radio. I've dedicated, I think, way too much time to this part, but the reason for me to speak longer is that the basis of the infrastructure of radio understood as a technical medium, the medium that makes electricity travel through free space encoded with signals, was really the backbone of everything that will happen further, was in the colonial project of Germany in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. So the origins of this material infrastructure of radio had to really be traced back to that moment in time. But as I told you, Germany lost the colonies because of the loss of World War I, but radio turned internally. So during the Weimar Republic, this radio, understood as a technical medium that I was telling you, became mass media, a one-to-many form of communication during the Weimar Republic in the interwar period. So now I just want to go through a few examples, because radio started to create its own form of urbanism in Weimar Republic Berlin. So here you see the fairgrounds designed by Martin Wagner and Hans Poelzig in 1929. And you will start to see that in this project that is still there in Berlin was extremely influential. Radio, you see here right on the spine of the book is a red radio tower drawn. These are beautiful drawings by Hans Poelzig. Here you see more of a bird's eye view, and you see here the tower. So in the fairgrounds, one of the three industries that were promoted was automobile industry, construction, and radio. These were the three major pillars of the industrial economy in Germany, Weimar Republic. And you see here the beautiful buildings to house, this was called the Funkhalle, so the radio hall, where products for the industry of radio, like radio receivers, but other gadgets were advertised. And here you see the antenna, the transmission tower placed next to the hall in the fairgrounds. Poelzig tried to design this hall, lost the competition, but he did this beautiful project of a tent-like building, and the structure of the transmission tower really fascinated a modernist imaginary. Here you see these photographs taken by Moholy Nash as him being fascinated by this nearly ghost-like building. But what really escaped the eye of modernist observers were buildings like this that were just wired across the street to the transmission tower, but because they were so massive and so monumental, escaped this obsession with the immaterial imaginary. And this is the Haus des Rundfunks, designed by Hans Poelzig. In 1929 was the competition, and the building was completed in 1931. This is the first broadcasting house ever done for the sole purpose of radio transmission. Here you see the floor plan that we will discuss more in detail in a second. But this building was originated at the moment when Germany had decided to centralize all the radio stations that were popping up in different parts of the country under one umbrella institution, which was called the RRG, the Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft, which was, you can understand it as a parallel to the BBC. And Germany decided to have a state monopoly over media because leaving media to the laissez-faire rules of commercial enterprises was conceived as being too dangerous for a politically fragile environment in the Weimar Republic. But the problem is that Hans Poelzig completed this building, invented the typology of the broadcasting house in 1931, but 2 years later, Adolf Hitler took power, and by virtue of taking power of the government in Germany, he took power of the entire media apparatus, which was centralized, and he could do whatever he pleased. Radio took an extremely important role in the building of the totalitarian regime of Hitler and other totalitarian regimes in Europe. I think we cannot understand the rise of totalitarianism in the 30s in Europe without looking at radio, really. And what is extremely incredible is that this typology that Poelzig invented in the 30s, Hitler disseminated to how the Reich as if they were mushrooms. So here it's just flipping through pages and pages of these broadcasting houses that, using the template of Poelzig's building, Hitler replicated in multiple parts of the Reich. You see, I mean, these are all, some of them extremely interesting buildings, but were all built between 1935 and 1943. There are many, many, many of them. And this is the kind of landscape that Hitler could create with the dissemination of that building. The entire Deutsches Reich was nearly covered or carpeted by radio waves, centrally led by the German or the German Reich. There is an important notion that was extremely important for Hitler, which was the word Gleichschaltung, which is, one can translate it as synchronization. So he wanted to have the synchronization of the Reich, that everything had to work in synchronicity at the same pace. And that this could only be achieved by the agency of radio, if you imagine, because the ideas could travel at the speed of light, and this metaphor of the Gleichschaltung, of the synchronicity, become real by virtue of how radio was used and implemented. But okay, we're still not even reaching the Cold War period, which is what the book is supposedly dedicated to. But here we come. So 1945 arrives. Soviet troops were the first one accessing German territory, and one of the first things they did, I think the second day after they entered Berlin, was to take over Hans Poelzig's building, the broadcasting house. At the same time, they dismantled this building, which was the Reichssender III, which was the single tallest building ever built until today in Europe, and it was the largest transmission station that the Reich had. So they demolished this, but they took control of the broadcasting station. And I would say that this was really the beginning of what will unleash the radio war between the East and the West in the Cold War period. Trying to get access to the immaterial medium of radio at the beginning of the Second World War in Berlin only meant sizing very big buildings, and the Soviets were extremely agile in that. So only a few days after they've entered Berlin, they had the broadcasting house by Poelzig. They conquered this tower that you see here. They connected the building to this, and a few days after, they started to operate immediately with radio. Americans, on the other hand, they didn't size any of the buildings, and at some point they asked permission to use Soviet facilities, and that permission was denied to them. And I think this is really one of the very first frictions between the East and the West. So the Americans needed to invent a different or an alternative architecture of radio in order to survive in this environment. So here you see two interesting reactions to that. This was a telephone exchange building, so the Americans started to broadcast radio through the phone, literally, You can imagine that that was not extremely popular, so they could only reach 1% of the audience. And also they created these trucks where they were circling around the city, providing their news and their little sources of entertainment as another alternative, since they didn't have the material backbone to properly broadcast. Very soon, in 1946, the Americans nevertheless sized this building, which was a former industrial building built in Nazi time, and they transformed it into their first broadcasting station, and they linked it to another tower in the south of Berlin. And 1 year after, they could finally start broadcasting, and very quickly, that meant that Americans were the most popular station both in East and West Berlin. So then you start to see that there is a correlation between the material infrastructure and the effect you can have in audiences, obviously. But what was interesting is that the building by Poelzig that the Soviets had taken was located in the British sector. So by the time the city was divided, of course, there were not the frictions that would emerge later. So the Soviets were now at the beginning of the 1950s, 5 years after the war, were broadcasting extremely loaded, politically loaded content, literally from the territory of the enemy, the Brits. The city was already politically divided. It was divided in 1949, no Berlin Wall yet. But it was this paradox in which, again, the Soviets were from the territory of their enemies, broadcasting content against, and that created an extremely big tension. So in 1952 is a very important year in the division, in the political division of Germany, and one of the events was, as you see in this image, that the British police forces encircled the building designed by Hans Poelzig. The Soviet radio workers had to leave. Now I'm using the word Soviet, but I should be saying German Democratic Republic, because the government had already been created, and they were forced to leave the headquarters that they had in Hans Poelzig building, and that triggered a very, very large transformation in the media infrastructure of East Germany. I will speak about the scale of the buildings in a second, but I just want you to imagine Berlin between 1945 and 1952 as a city in which buildings are being conquered, taking over, just to get control over this medium that was taking more and more relevance, but it was very difficult to control under this very frictional political context. So, as I said, this reaction from the East German government to try to reconquer the audiences after the Americans have become so popular would have a very specific architectural reaction that I will, at the scale of the building, that I will talk in a second. But now I want us to, since this is the chapter of the territory, I want us to look at these maps in which you see here. These are all drawn by the East German authorities, so how they try to really conquer their entire side of the country. This is only drawing East Germany with the agency of their own signals. So you start to see a kind of like territorial planning, but from the perspective of radio. So each of these, let's say, amorphous shapes is the effect of the radio transmitter, and these are the ones that you were seeing here that were built in different parts of the eastern side of the country. And this map shows the opposite, right? So if these ones were showing you how only the East German territory was being colonized by their own signals, this one shows how from the east they were also trying to expand towards the west, so it's a kind of like internal protection but also projection. And the same was happening in the other direction. So these were maps that show where were all the transmitters located from the western alleys towards East Germany. So you see here the border between East and West Germany as like totally built up with these transmitters as if they were launching pads, bombarding the East with their so-called objective news. And you see here, very interesting, of course, Berlin in the center of East Germany, with transmitters of the enemy also inside because of the conditions of very particular conditions of territorial division of Germany that you know very well. This map, I think, is very interesting because it shows how East and West Germany began to be almost like a San Geminiano, totally covered with towers, having impacts either to protect their internal territory with their own signals or expand towards the other side. And this is really the context in which this map appears, when not only the entire country, but a nearly micro-urbanism in the city of Berlin was being crafted by jamming signals from one side to the other. Here is a little bit of information on how the Americans kept further developing their infrastructure. And then, well, this is a story that perhaps now it's not the most important to explain, but for those of you who know Berlin, this is how Teufelsberg, the famous hill built with war rubble that has this very secret, mysterious station on top. I discovered this fantastic material that shows how it was completely full with radars for the Americans to listen to very far out in the eastern bloc, and that rubber wall was built on top of this building, which was a gigantic university for telecommunication that Hitler had built before. So it's a kind of like interesting palimpsest. But with this, I think you get a sense of how the territory was really planned and competed and contested through the agency of radio. So I just want to read you a few words on how I was conceptualizing this division in the book. So, what was to be conquered and what was to be defended if there was no territorial invasion, strictly speaking? Can we speak about two different forms of producing space that in fact coexist in the same territory, a fight over sovereignty relative to borders that are no longer clearly delineated, but rather temporally defined by another form of spatial production and dissemination? This is a quote. Has state socialism produced a space of its own? This was the question that Henri Lefebvre posed in 1974 in arguably one of the most compelling critiques ever written about space. Here I'm speaking about the famous book of Lefebvre. For Lefebvre, the evolving characteristic of capitalist space could be clearly defined. It was, quote, abstract space, which includes the world of commodities, its logics, and its worldwide strategies, as well as the power of money and that of the political state. This space is found on the vast network of banks, business centers, major productive entities, and also on motorways, airports, and lattices. Within this space, the town, once the forcing house of accumulation, fountainhead of wealth, and center of historical space, has disintegrated. End of quote. That's Lefebvre. By comparison, the nature of socialist space proved more elusive, but was nonetheless central for his analysis, as he famously stated, and again I'm quoting Lefebvre again here, a revolution that does not produce a new space has not realized its full potential. This is one of the most amazing phrases ever written by Lefebvre. Indeed, it has failed in that it has not changed life itself, but has merely changed ideological superstructures, institutions, or political apparatuses. A social transformation, to be truly revolutionary in character, must manifest a creative capacity in its effects on daily life, on language, and on space. Through its impact need not occur at the same rate or with equal force in each of these areas. What I was how I try to close this chapter here is to say that people, even extremely intelligent people like Lefebvre and extremely perceptive, really left or concluded the book on the production of space really not knowing where socialist space was produced. Lefebvre said it cannot be that it's in the monumental avenues and the monumental buildings. It has to be something else, but he couldn't really spot it. And my little contribution or observation in this book is that socialist space, in my eyes, was mainly tried to be constructed through radio, through broadcasting, as a different form of affecting and disseminating daily life, but through the agency of a different kind of sound, of a different kind of information. So that's chapter 1, and I realize I need to go a bit quicker. But I think this lays the foundations of what has to come. So now we go to chapter number 2, which in terms of scale is dedicated to the scale of the building. And the central object on here is this floor plan. It's the floor plan of the Funkhaus in der Nalepa-Straße, the broadcasting house that East Germany had to build after they were kicked out of the building that they have been occupying by Hans Poelzig in 1952. It's a totally delusional floor plan, absolutely fascinating, that we will discuss in a second. It took me a while to understand it, and this is the building that I encountered the first time that kind of triggered my interest to write about radio. So now we're going to look a little bit at the history of the broadcasting house as a building type. Very interesting to note and to start this chapter with is the figure, the architect that designed the Funkhaus in der Nalepa-Straße, which is this building that you see here too. As I told you, East Germans were kicked out from the building that they had in the West. And by the time they were kicked out in 1952, they were already building a building. They knew that this could happen. And who was building that building? It was an architect whose name was Franz Ehrlich. It was a very mysterious person that has been trained at the Bauhaus. He left the Bauhaus at some point and then spent most of his life, right after he left the Bauhaus, he was in prison by the Gestapo for being in alliance with certain communist associations as a young designer. And between 1933 and 1945, during 12 years, Franz Ehrlich was either in concentration camp or working for the army in some capacity. And it's a very strange history because he basically survived by designing concentration camps. So he was a communist, rather opportunistic, that managed to not be a prisoner but then start to work for the camps. It's unclear. He always depicted himself as a kind of activist, trying to change things from within as he was being forced to do this, otherwise he was going to be killed. But then he said how much he learned and working for the German army. And I think this for me was a very interesting reflection of what it meant to be educated as an architect in the 20th century, because Franz Ehrlich, not many people know about him, but those who know, it's always portrayed as a Bauhaus architect. But he went to the Bauhaus 2 years, and for those of you who know about the pedagogy of the Bauhaus, people were doing beautiful color drawings and sketches, but they didn't teach you much about how to do buildings, let alone big buildings, nor infrastructures. And this person got commissioned to do buildings like this, fresh out of the war. So the interesting reflection for me was to understand that the war, concentration camps, and the army were a source of production of architects and quote-unquote education, because people came very, very prepared to take very big design tasks like this one, fresh out of the war. This was Franz Ehrlich. I want to read you now a few things that I found in the archives on how Franz Ehrlich described his time being first in prison, then in concentration camp. I start by a quote. Terror Wave 4. Continuation of the stake hanging method, going over the trestle, gate standing, first attempt at gassing. End of quote. This is from Ehrlich's lapidary but thorough account of the torture and killing mechanisms he observed at Buchenwald. Buchenwald was the concentration camp he nearly designed. Going over the trestle meant the prisoner buttocks were beaten with a bullwhip until the skin burst open. gate standing required the victim to stand in the open with their arms raised. If they lowered their arms or fell over, they were beaten until they stood up and or died. He described the escalation of horror. Quote again. Terror Wave 5, Jew action. Goebbels admit that the party congress that 60 Jews die a day at a concentration camp near Weimar because they're working from morning to night. Prisoners are nailed into boxes covered with barbed wire, which are lined up at the gate until they die of starvation. Shooting prisoners. Guards order them to be carried over the guard chain so they can shoot them in greater comfort. Number of dead in this wave not possible to determine. End of quote. After noting, quote again, first attempts by camp physicians to kill by air injection into the bloodstream, end of quote, he states that in, quote again, October 1939, the first Poles were brought to the camp and completely exterminated by just abandoning them on the ground. Bearing witness of the scale of this extermination, Ehrlich describes how it happened that corpses fell from a truck loaded with more than 100 of them, and they remained on the streets of Weimar for a long time. By the end of 1939, Ehrlich said, all Weimar residents knew what was going on in Buchenwald. Here I continue. Ehrlich also gives an account of the technological advances in the machinery of death, writing about the, quote, prototype of a portable crematorium developed by Topf and Sons in Erfurt. Involve all the leading engineers and technicians of the company, end of quote. Through the positions, though he positioned himself throughout as an outsider, as this I was telling you is a very cunning person, of these actions, it is clear from these descriptions that he learned a great deal about architecture and its capacity to do great harm as well as its potentially of subversive power. He describes the countermeasurements he engaged in, relating that, quote, political prisoners employed in the photography department, the Fotoabteilung, took over the running of the construction program and set up a radio transmitter powered by the electricity generator for the commandant's office. By both means, with the involvement of the SS men, messages about the situation here reached the public. So you see a little early engagement with the radio of Franz Ehrlich in the concentration camp. As crude as it might sound, Ehrlich's experience at the concentration camp taught him something he had not learned at the Bauhaus, namely how to professionally conceive architecture in terms of processes and functions. The architect who would go on to redesign the entire media infrastructure of East Germany after the war wars, for better or worse, was educated under these conditions. Okay, so I'm going to skip about how the building of Hans Poelzig came to be realized. It was at the moment, as I told you, when mass media, so radio as technical medium becomes mass media in the Weimar Republic. It becomes this activity at the intersection of culture and industry. I enter here in a debate that I cannot go too far in it with the theories of Theodor Adorno on the culture industry. So what happened to culture when it intersected the mechanisms of production of the industry? It is fascinating for me that, again, a good observer like Adorno never bothered to see how this thing that he described as something immaterial and alienating was taking shape in very specific buildings by very specific architectural mechanisms, and this is a bit the contribution I'm making here. For me, it's a fascinating image, again, that pays off all these hours in the archive. This model in which you see that in order for something to exist in the 1930s had to pass through the broadcasting house as a filter in order to be dissolved in the air and reach the masses. So we start to understand the broadcasting house as this architecture that very materially dematerializes everything in order to be recaptured at further distances. Very quickly, just how the building works. Here's another floor plan inside the book. But basically what Hans Poelzig invented was that you had 3 broadcasting rooms at the center, and then all the bureaucratic program that is more the industrial side of broadcasting is outside of it, protecting the central studios from the outside noise, and that's very much the pattern that would be replicated across the globe. Here I will also not go into too much detail, but the book makes a little detour here to Britain, to how the BBC constructed their own broadcasting house, and also how they created their own presence in the empire and colonies by replicating a model very similar to the one that Hans Poelzig has done before. And this is another fascinating project, which is when at the same moment, so in Germany is 1931, the BBC is 1932, and here in the US, also in 1932, this is all the same years. I don't know how many of you know, but the Rockefeller Center basically only exists because of the RCA tower. What is RCA? Radio Corporation of America. So the Radio Corporation of America really saved what was at the time a totally collapsed real estate project by Rockefeller. And what was inside the RCA tower in the first 10 floors was nothing else but the production studios of NBC, which was the kind of entertainment subsidiary of the RCA. And here is again, I cannot go into too many details, but it's a fascinating translation of Hans Poelzig's typology that was crafted on one level here, turned into a vertical scheme to fit the typology of the skyscraper with a number of other technical problems associated to it, and also a number of political problems associated to it, because here we are seeing a model in which radio is totally entangled with very large private corporations, and we see that very clearly in the forms of production that nevertheless are the same typological guidelines, but with very different specificities too. But again, I cannot go into too much detail. Here the book goes again and to see how Hitler, once he took power, transformed the house by Poelzig to its own wills. But here we are approaching the building done by Hans Poelzig, by Franz Ehrlich in the eastern side of the city. So again, the Eastern Germans are being kicked out. They were already designing a new building. And here it's fascinating to see that this is not really a building. It's really a factory. It's a compound of buildings. So perhaps I'll just finalize by saying that at this moment in time in the Cold War period, due to both technological innovations but also the scale of the political conflicts, the typology of the broadcasting house was redefined from within. So we are no longer seeing, as we saw in the 1930s, a unitary, coherent building. This is really nearly a city within a city, in which now each of these buildings performs a role, a program that was previously inserted within this coherent form, because the scale of operation just had escalated. So in this building, the GDR concentrated its entire media operation, so more than 10,000 people were working here every day, speaking more than 10 different languages, broadcasting to other parts of the globe. So here I go a little bit more in detail, explaining exactly how these mechanisms work, but I think it's important for me to also biographically to finish perhaps with this story, because in 1960s they extended the house, and this is one of the buildings that you saw in the master plan. This was created in 1958 when the GDR decided to expand their international presence. Why? Because they realized that they needed to have a kind of like socialist solidarity with the other countries in the Cold War. And here for me this is important, as I was telling you, because this was created in the 1960s, and it was started to use as the international voice, broadcasting to Latin America, to Africa, and elsewhere from Eastern Germany. And now I'll read you a passage and that tells you a little bit how this international part was used. So, Radio Berlin International's global aspirations. Radio Berlin International was the international voice, right? Global aspirations, along with Block E's architecture, this is the Block A architecture, would be tested by an event that took place 12,000 kilometers from Berlin. At 1910, on September 11, 1973, the socialist president of Chile, Salvador Allende, addressed the Chilean people through radio, announcing the fall of his government following a violent US-sponsored coup d'etat. Sharp, historically conscious, and poetic as always, Allende's last words on radio still haunt Chile's collectives of conscious. The president has used the only architecture of radio available to him after the bombardment of the transmission towers of Radio Portales and Radio Cooperación in what the military called Operación Silencio, silence operation. He had picked up the iron, which was the magnetic telephone that directly connected the presidential office in La Moneda with the broadcasting studio of Radio Magallanes, not yet seized by the new regime, and asked to be put on air. The station director, whose name was Guillermo Reves Santis, responded immediately, and within seconds, Allende was given his last address. The media conditions that made possible the historic event was precarious chain. A telephone line pressed against a microphone, the microphone inside a studio linked to a tape recorder, which was in turn wired to a transmission station located in Renca on the northwest outskirts of Santiago. With a prophetic tone, Allende famously set down in tape and not in stone that history is ours and it's made by the people. His consciousness of being at a historical crossroads flashes against a sonic background of bullets and fire on his end and on sounds of people running and screaming on the other end of the line. Beyond Allende's words, everything that was real in that moment got stored on tape. The president recognized he would pay with my life for my loyalty to the people. 4 hours later, he was dead, and everyone who has worked for the few radio stations loyal to the socialist regime had either been killed or forced into hiding. Still strong for me to read these words. So from this building, from the moment of this event of the coup d'etat in 1973, a radio program was transmitted to Chile during the 16 years of the dictatorship every single day for half an hour. I encountered the sound archives of this. I go a little bit on that in the pages that follow in the book, but it's a very interesting testimony of how the international wing of the GDR, the presence, operated for decades from this part of the building. And to come full circle to where we started, in order to reach Chile was not only a problem of production, but a problem of transmission. And this plant that you see here, and this little antenna that says Chile here, cross mark, was the antenna that they built in order to reach Chile. And when was this? This was in Nauen. So basically the building where we started here, yes, correct. Here, when we started, the infrastructure that was meant to connect the Wilhelminian Germany with the colonies in Africa and Latin America, nearly 60 years later, was retransformed now to reach from East Germany to their socially solidary countries elsewhere in the world, making a kind of full circle of the history of the implementations of these infrastructures. There's, of course, more to be discussed, but I'll leave it there, and I hope we still have a few minutes for questions, and sorry for taking a little longer. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk.
I have one. You were defining this broadcasting house as a typology inside this. Well, the text is type inside the radio of architecture, and it's completely related to its function, right? The size, the scale, and everything. And I was wondering if you find any difference between the ones from the East and the West that maybe goes beyond functionality. Because the ideology that they were broadcasting is completely different, right? But then the buildings look like there was a type that is...
Yes, I think it's a great question, and I think there are different ways of answering. I mean, I think one is by the term of type itself, like one of the things I was fascinated by starting to see broadcasting houses as a series of buildings, not as one, is that I started to conceive the idea of typology slightly different. If we, because again, the Rossian idea of type that emerged in the 60s as this kind of particular theory of how form relates to program is not sufficient to understand this, because I thought there were two new ingredients. One is electrical technical media, so architectural form. I can explain you very specific how it was really giving form by virtue of the agency of tape recorders inside buildings. We can discuss this in a second. So electric technical media and politics as two new ingredients that are really crafting architectural form. And so if we take that seriously, that electrical technical media and politics shape form, architectural form, your question is like, okay, if we have different political orientations, it had to yield different kinds of forms, right? I mean, there's, and it is the case. So, for example, two examples looking at this floor plan. From the technical point of view, when the broadcasting house was invented in the 30s, the tape recorder was not invented yet. The radio was a live phenomenon. So whatever you recorded, you had to broadcast it immediately. It was not the capacity to store for longer periods of time sound. It was a real-time phenomenon. The tape recorder was invented during the war for spy reasons, and then in the 1950s, it was already operating within studios. It's a fascinating story, actually, how the tape recorder was discovered within German rubble. But this floor plan, you only understand it if you see it through the lens of the tape recorder, because this was the space where the tape recorder was located at the center. Then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 studios linked. So now you could have 4 performances and simultaneously record them, mix them, do a kind of montage before broadcasting. So the development of radio plays that are kind of like montage with the tape recorder, which was extremely important for the GDR. It's both, politics and again, technical media giving architectural form. This again is the floor plan of the eastern side, and this is perhaps another of the most interesting moments, is because the GDR, in order to differentiate themselves from the Americans, what they decided was that they had to vouch for classical music, because they said, we have no way to compete with the trashy canned music that at the beginning was jazz and then rock and roll, the Beatles and so on. Our broadcasting, all the youth was fascinated with it. So how do we counteract this? And they vouched for classical music, because they said we cannot go for this capitalist trash. So they said, as a kind of the sound reaction of social realism was, okay, we're going to have the highest performing classical music studio so that people can perceive this quality in their homes. And there are fascinating programs on how they are teaching really the population on how to listen, how to recognize that quality that is embedded in these studios. And what is fascinating here also is that you see this is until today the best recording studio ever done. So people still rent it on the thousands every day, but has no place for an audience. So it's another fascinating moment in which, for the first time, microphones and machines start to replace people in space. And the seats here are only for the orchestra. You cannot be seated there. And I think it's, again, a fascinating moment in the history of architecture when we start to see people disappearing from the buildings and being replaced by machines in order to be affected yet in their domestic spaces further down the road. So. And it is very different to what the broadcasting houses of the Americans look, for example, because they had no interest in classical music, so they look very differently.
So thank you very much for the lecture. What really fascinated me was the fact that Ani, if I pronounce correctly, was the one who designed one of the two very important buildings that you mentioned as well, the House.
Yeah.
And so he was also appointed to, as you mentioned, design the concentration camps. Which I think that's my question. Do you think? How do you think that influences his architecture, specifically on that building? And is it manifested in his architecture, his experiences during that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a polemic formulation that I have in the book, but it's not entirely original either. The relationship of this Bauhaus idea of total design and how it was deployed under totalitarianism in the 30s and 40s in Germany is something that has been studied by different scholars. But in my interpretation here is that when I really curiously started to see, okay, where did somebody that, went to the Bauhaus 3 years, then it was in theory imprisoned for 12 years, and then walks out of prison, the war ends, and designs a building that is thousands of square meters, extremely intelligent, full of good functional decisions with an extremely high technical competence. I was like, how did that happen? I mean, I am a practicing architecture too, and I struggle a lot solving 300 square meter houses, and I've went a lot of years to university and so on. So the answer of how specific the architecture of a concentration camp appears in a broadcasting house is open to debate, but what is clear to me that the understanding of architecture and this is something that in German historiography is very clear. I mean, the ultimate functional building is the concentration camp. I mean, is function brought to its limit, and this person was very, very close to that form of architecture and that form of training. So when one sees these buildings, it's difficult to establish a very big distance then, because we know that someone like Ehrlich only really learned about architecture by his involvement and those kind of processes.
I have a question. I wanted to ask, what do you think were the key difference between the Western and the Eastern bloc of countries, using radio as a tool for a propaganda or a cultural tool for cultural influence or manipulation of the public opinion and having a control over it? What was the key difference between the both of them? Because I think both were doing it at the same time.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's a good question because I finished the book with a reflection on what is the relationship between architecture and politics, and specifically if we see it through the lens of the architecture of radio. We tend to believe that political ideas are stable and are coherent, and they could be applied to buildings, and buildings are kind of like passive receptors of political ideas that come from the side of their creators. But when you look at these stories, the story is extremely more nuanced in the sense that the architecture has its politics, but that politics not perfectly aligns with the politics of those who created it. And I'll give you a few examples because this sounds perhaps a bit clumsy at first glimpse, that architecture itself could have politics and kind of circumvent the desires of those who design. I mean, I know that this could sound clumsy or perhaps even too architecture believer, but for example, the what I was telling you about the program broadcasted to Chile, it is. I'm not naive, and it is clear that the level of control of the dissemination of information in the GDR was extremely high, and all what we know about propaganda was true to a great extent. But these were large operations with many people that opportunistically also tried to work within the system to achieve different ends. So, for example, cases like that I told you about Chile is an extremely heroic moment that meant the world for many people, and yet was done within this infrastructure that was extremely alienating and extremely controlled. So, and the same goes from the side of the Americans. I mean, the agency of the information control from the side of Americas, how news were really crafted in order to destabilize other political systems was gigantic. At the same time, all the media in Chile was 100% controlled by the Americans, as if it was the propaganda of the GDR. So the boundaries of these big umbrellas of this is propaganda, this is free news, when you see here is very nuanced, and this is not a story of relativization, but it's a story of seeing, okay, people have agency within the systems, and could push back and redirect the course of events in certain cases. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I have another question. It's more related to your research process. Because, I mean, there's a lot of content here, like visual content, plans, and a lot of interpretation. And when you mentioned the sound archives, and when I was reading the extracts from the book, I was wondering, like, how important was for your process, like, to look for this archive and to actually listen to this, not only like looking for content, the historical content, but also to understand like the buildings, the things that you describe in the text, like how a building works with that audio. And I don't know, this thing really fascinated me, and when I was listening to you, and if I read all the book and in the text, I was like immediately wanted to listen to all these things that you were describing. And so that's my question, like how important was this process? And another question related, did you ever thought about including like these things in the book?
Yes, okay.
May I interject?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of an interrelated question. I think because maybe to make it even more specific, is you are sort of Janus-faced. Right? You are a practitioner on the one hand, you design and make things, but then you are also very specifically a scholar and a historian, which, this is what I would argue, which is basically fundamentally different. I mean, because it's fundamentally different than somebody who is an architect, who has a scholarly interest, and is exploring things, and is maybe a kind of curiosity or almost fetish for the archive or for objects. And I can imagine, Andrea, that you were, look at the fold-outs in the book, oh my God, right? You and Thiermann, so this is, so there's this kind of one idea, right? But then as a training and as a historian, right, you are also asking a broader set of questions, right? Or you have a kind of a greater depth of knowledge, right? And so there's a kind of fine line between all these things. So maybe to kind of, but that's why this book is interesting, because you're at, quote unquote, the intersection of these two worlds, right? So, maybe apologies for interjecting, but I think it's really important to kind of nuance this, because maybe in our immediate context, how I would define your question is more as a kind of what is design research, which is a kind of weird abstract notion, but this is not a diss, but you're never going to be a historian, right? Or you have no interest to be a historian, right? But you're very curious about the world, right? I mean, which is fundamentally different where he wants to be, he is a historian, right? So he has a set of questions for, anyways. I hope everybody gets the nuance there.
I'll try to. I think these three things, both of your questions and what you just said, Solomon, I think are related. So I'll try to bring them together. First is, we had a technical glitch. I was willing. Also, I realized I took for far too long. So I was willing to show you some experts of sounds, and it's funny because I tried to write about sounds, and which is the written medium is extremely clumsy to everything that goes beyond the realm of the symbolic, as Kidla used to say. So everything that is vibration, reverberations, this medium is horrible for it. That's why I included these QR codes. So by the time the book is out, there are going to be a few essays on our website with links to some of the sound archives. So that's the kind of this cannibalistic aspect of books that I really like, that they absorb all the new media and incorporate it into them. And I think that's why the book is such a resilient medium that manages to cannibalize all new inventions. But answering your did I meant to include this here? I try to include it through this kind of stuff, but also trying to find a way of how to write about sound. but for me it was extremely important, to just do that, like to go to these archives and try to understand the buildings from the medium in which they were meant to perform. And I think for me this was, again, a fascinating media historical realization that, again, I generally don't try to come with theory to projects. I like when projects give you theory back by being an honest observer of things. So I was like, all this debate, writing is like drawing, it's a kind of like abstraction that leaves a lot of things outside. And it was like, now I understood it. Yeah, of course, I could look endlessly at these floor plans and I would never get the texture of these buildings. And if I really wanted to see or like really get myself into these buildings, even going there was not so useful. And I had to confront these tapes. And these tapes are not historical documents because when you play them, they are live. I mean, they are the exact same thing that someone in 1956 would have listened to it. And that's the beauty, and again, Hitler wrote extensively about this, that there's nothing historical, or the very idea of history collapses against these records because, there's nothing historical about them because they are on real time. You are confronted with the same present, but in a different moment, but things are present to you. And I think this was beautiful about doing this, because again are things that have never crossed my mind before. I mean, and to the point, to my personal biography is like, I consider myself an architect, and I do different kinds of projects and different kinds of media. So when I embarked in this project, I remember my mentor, Louis Cohen, told me you have to play each game by its own rules. So I didn't like to write a book that could be the theory of a practice. I was not interested in doing that. I took this book as a project, and I did it within the rules of how you... And I think it has a lot of the jargon of historical scholarship, because I wanted to learn that process, but I think it has, inevitably the angle of someone that, it's curious about other aspects of architecture as well, and I hope that also could resonate and bring historical scholarship closer to practitioners, which it doesn't need to be like this, but I think if these gaps are coming closer, it's good news, I think, for everybody.
Another question more to the type, the architect, how you have been studying, imagine, lots of these buildings throughout the world, not only maybe in Germany. How has the type evolved when the technology has evolved so much too? Does much of these buildings still function as radio transmission buildings? Have most of them evolved to different things, or has a type been suiting new needs new cultural needs in present times?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, the building, this one by Poelzig, it just turned 90 years of uninterrupted use in 2021. So now it's like 92 or something. So it's been extremely resilient. I mean, the building of the BBC is still in use, and the one of the NBC too, to my knowledge. Yeah.
The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon.
I went 2 weeks ago to visit the building. I guess you all know Kersten Gears because also has a bit of a history with this institution. So Kersten is now building a gigantic broadcasting station for the French-Swiss radio station right next to my school. And to my surprise, the typological guidelines of the building being designed by Kersten are extremely similar to this, even though he was not aware of these buildings when I discussed with him. So there seems to be something interesting to observe at the origins of these buildings, that there was an extremely smart and intelligent architectural response to a program that is both extremely specific, but also at the same time it changes very quickly. So in some parts of the book, I describe them not that technology influenced the buildings, so like scientific knowledge gave strict parameters of how to take architectural decisions, that this is how we also try to write histories of technology when they relate to architecture, right? There was some things, a smart scientist in a laboratory that figured something out, and then the architects follow because this is science, and it's a kind of like one-directional line of influence from science to architecture. What we see here is that Poelzig took very clear decisions of, the studios have to be surrounded by the bureaucratic programs, their courtyards, blah, blah. But the internal mechanisms, the internal specificities has changed a lot. So the building is both rigid enough with certain clear guidelines that allowed for a certain kind of specificity, but at the same time is open enough so that all the minute changes that come from the side of acoustic engineers and so on are absorbed by the building, and the robustness of it continues to exist. So I think, again, there's an interesting dialogue in this that one can learn beyond the act of broadcasting, that the relationship between architectural form and technology. Technology, we know that changes at a different speed that architecture. Architecture is not any kind of technology. It relates to technology. And actually, Hans Poelzig wrote beautifully about this in a very interesting way also. What is really the relationship between architecture and technology? It's not quite a technology, but you cannot imagine it without it. And yeah, I think it's a longer debate, but there's a few of that in the pages of the book.
I wanted to ask, because you made an interesting analogy of the invisible waves and architecture, and I think also important part of this radio medium is the recipient, right? So how would you say that this point of departure and point of like the recipient and the departure and these waves, like how does it translate maybe on an urban scale, maybe also relating to that map of the waves?
No, this is a great question, because I think at some point in the book I try to describe this architecture of radio as a chain, right? So it starts with a voice in a room, and here we are in the realm of the mechanics, right? So I'm speaking, my vocal cords are vibrating, and I'm making air vibrate. So this is all the realm of the mechanics. But what the broadcasting houses needed to do is to transform that mechanical phenomenon of vibrations into an electrical one by being in dialogue with very specific mechanisms like a microphone. So the microphone turns vibrations and transforms them into electricity. Now your voice can travel through a cable. That cable goes through, if we make it very short, to the transmission station, in which that electricity is amplified, and when it starts to vibrate through the tower of the antenna, it changes from the electric to the electromagnetic, and when that chain occurs, then electricity starts to travel through air, and when it reaches the domestic space, you have another little building that you don't realize it's a building, but it's the receiver, in which turns the electromagnetic again into electric, and then through the speaker again into the mechanic, and then goes to your ear. And again, because of the mechanic, affects you on the other end of the chain. So that's the kind of like the chain of the architecture of radio. And I think there are a few events in which architecture intersects that chain. So one is in the moment of production, right, in the broadcasting houses, then in the moment of transmission with the antennas and the transmitters, and then in the moment of reception when the domestic space, who used to be this isolated bubble for the purity of the family, it's somewhat polluted all of a sudden with modernity. The noises on outside, concert halls, news, chaos enter the domestic space. So I have to confess that I wanted to write another chapter of this book only dedicated to how domesticity really got transformed by this, and there are only a few comments on that, and I think this TBD aspect of the project. Yeah.
Do we still have time to ask another question?
Mm-hmm.
I was very interested when you said about the condition in the 1930s of the rise of the totalitarian thought, but also the idea that the radio was centralized. I mean, the power of radio was centralized because of the politically fragile environment. And I was also getting back to what you said in the very beginning of your presentation about you asking the question, basically posing what is the question of the architecture in seemingly immaterial presence that even I think we're living in now. So how do you kind of transpose that idea in your research on a specific historical moment? And what are your thoughts also as a practicing architect? Maybe what is the role of the building you would say now? Because I think that there are some interesting conditions that are quite similar in terms of kind of the tendencies of the mixture of politics and media and the influence and kind of the aspirations of larger corporations and kind of the grasp of the power. So what would you say maybe your reflections are today?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, is beyond the scope of the book, so what I'm going to say now, you will not find it there, but of course, when one does these things, you inevitably you are forced to think, right? And of course, we are writing, I'm not writing in the 1930s, I'm writing today, and I cannot avoid making the parallels between the emergence of a new media and the emergence of a new model of totalitarian politics. I think we are seeing this in front of our very eyes. We are seeing the media revolution of the 21st century, and we are seeing in front of our eyes the emergence of a new totalitarian political model that is using one-to-one that media in order to disseminate its message. I think I would even venture to argue that every new media revolution puts the thread of a new totalitarian political model to emerge. A lot of people have written about what happened in the 1930s, how really the orator as a totalitarian actor emerged in relationship to radio. So the totalitarian leader of the 30s is an orator, what is the totalitarian ruler of today vis-a-vis the new media condition? I think we're seeing it. We know that there are people that kind of like exit television, but it's not exactly that. I think it's an interesting question. But going back to the side of buildings, I think if there's one thing I wanted to do with this project is that the only way in which we can grasp the politics of media is by putting it on the ground. Because it's really I think that's the fascinating aspect of architecture, that when you look at it carefully, all the frictions that matter brings with it are present, and you cannot avoid it. So the myth that we live in the cloud, I think is a very dangerous one, and I think if there is a little contribution that projects like this can make to today is if we want to politicize media, we need to look at its material. That's what I would say.
Maybe I have one final question because we need to wrap it up. Going back to the earlier, just as a kind of reflection, maybe through this work or maybe more abstract, could you just maybe share with us your position on the relationship between theory and history? So at least in East Coast American context, that has a very kind of maybe particular kind of vantage point. And I would say, well, maybe reflect on these intersections of having a kind of, let's say, situating things within their kind of historical context, but then also, as you're talking about the contemporary, how theory is essentially used as a discursive means to discuss the present. So you actually need this kind of interjection or interrelationship between both things, both realities. There is no theory without history, and there's no history without theory. Is an adage, whereas, at least in this building, nobody's here, theory is seen as a kind of applied philosophy, as something that is additional. And I mean, I don't come from that tradition, and I don't think you do either. So maybe just a kind of reflection on this.
No, this is very interesting. I think for whatever reason, this even, I don't know why in the place where I teach now, this question at some point became extremely relevant and was giving people's jobs and were taking jobs away from other people. And I think so I had to come to terms with some kind of reflection on this. And first of all, to say that I really sympathize with what you just last said, which is any clear distinction between history and theory is a totally artificial one. So there it's impossible to think about theory without having a historical backbone, even if it's minimum. And it's impossible to do any kind of interesting history derived from theory. But we know that they're not the same. So they're not the same thing. You cannot imagine one without the other. There are people that do a lot of history, very little theory, and vice versa. I mean, I try to, it's of course extremely arrogant to say that, but Benjamin is clearly, one can say, is a theorist, and he wrote the most important text to understand the role of history, for example. And what Benjamin says in his philosophy of history is that, as opposed to historicism, the material historian has to rescue a spark from the past that can help us rescue the present from the rest of the victor. It's like how to liberate the present from the conquer of the victor. That's what Benjamin said, that the agency of the materialist historian is to bring a spark from the past that can illuminate the present and liberate it from those who are in control. And basically what he means by that is those who create a stable narrative. So history is a means to destabilize the established narratives in the present. And of course this is extremely perhaps far-reaching aspiration, but a work like this can only try to be a tiny contribution to that aspiration, that history is not something that is meant to explain or organize things that have happened, but by virtue of recasting light on those episodes, we are basically talking to ourselves in the present in a new way.
Thank you.
Yeah.